Hi everyone, my name is Philipp Meissner. Welcome to What's Next. Today we're diving into the future of the United States and its role on the global stage. Our guest is Jörn Fleck, a senior director at the Atlantic Council who brings a wealth of experience on US-EU relations, digital policy and global strategy. If you want to better understand the shifts shaping the world superpower, this conversation is for you. Jörn is a senior director with the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, where he focuses on critical topics like US-EU trade and the transatlantic digital policies. The Atlantic Council, for those unfamiliar, is a leading non-partisan think tank that helps shape solutions to global challenges. Jörn, welcome to What's Next.
Thank you so much for having me, Philip, and very much looking forward to the conversation.
So there's a lot happening in the Trump administration at the moment. We see discussions from tariffs to a potential reconsideration of the value of the transatlantic partnerships. So from your perspective, what key shifts should we expect in the US domestic and foreign policy under the Trump administration?
So a big question, but clearly President Trump has returned to the White House with a new sense of self-assuredness and confidence that he can really shake things up. And I think what we're already seeing in the first 7-8 weeks of his presidency, his second term, is a wholesale revision, or at least the attempt at a wholesale revision of U.S. global engagement along the lines of his America First principles and policies. And so we're seeing that play out on the foreign and defense policy front, and we can dive into that a little bit more. We're seeing that on the economic, trades, and tariff policy front, and we're seeing that on the domestic side of things. And in all of these areas, I think we're seeing a very ambitious push to really reshape how the United States does business, so to speak.
So when we double click on the foreign part, where do you see the major priorities for the administration?
Yeah, so I think the administration and President Trump in particular combine sort of inspiration from a number of strands in existing American political and economic thought that I think Trump puts a particular spin on in ways that only he can. And so we have this combination of drawing on a Jacksonian tradition, right? A president that Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States in essentially the late 1820s and early 30s, really focused on a sort of nativist, hyper-realist in many ways approach, one that was a populist approach to U.S. foreign policy, something that should serve the working man, and he as the champion of the working man, and someone who was sort of afraid of too much foreign entanglement and really using U.S. power, but only for vital national interests. We have some sort of harking back to the isolationism of especially the 1930s. We have a return to sort of McKinley and the mercantilist, high tariff, protectionist tradition. But in all of this, you see some tensions and some contradictions that haven't quite been resolved and that continue to play out as we all watch the new administration's policies. And as I said, there's a particular spin of President Trump's own unique persona and personal history embedded or layered on top of all of this.
President Trump has promised a golden age for the United States. Do you think this vision could translate into a positive era for the rest of the world, or might this come at the expense of global cooperation?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. Golden age for whom, right? Even the Gilded Age was a golden age for a few. I think what we're seeing on especially this economic front, we're seeing again an attempt to really fundamentally reshape American global international economic engagement. I think we've seen a number of people speak about this. The Treasury Secretary, the new chair of President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, really talking about how broken the international economic and financial systems are, how the overvaluation of the US dollar is a fundamental structural challenge to the United States, to its competitiveness, to its manufacturing sector, how burden sharing and the role of the United States as a security guarantor overall is very costly for the American people, for the American industrial base, for US competitiveness, and how this has to be fundamentally shifted with both sweeping tariff policies and a new approach to dollar strength. So addressing that overvaluation of the US dollar in order to reshape and shake up US economic policy and US economic interaction, trade, finance interaction with the rest of the world. And I think here again, the president and his team are really trying to fundamentally reshape that interaction with the global economy, and we will see how that plays out. I think we're already seeing a number of unintended consequences playing out in the markets, in the overall economy. If you combine that with sort of the domestic drive for deregulation, cutting back government and government services, and sort of this DOGE Department of Government Efficiency effort, and how that is impacting different sectors of the economy and even consumer prices and consumer services, you're seeing sort of, the first initial signs of that plan running into some, at a minimum, some friction, possibly into some major obstacles.
When I work with companies, there's one big question, and I think this also questioned everybody in Davos at this January. How should political and business leaders strategize and navigate the Trump administration? What advice would you give to them to effectively engage in the US and with the US in the next years?
So that's a really tough question. I think we're all trying to figure that out in different ways. And I do think there's a slight difference between corporate leaders and political leaders that, have slightly different incentives and different objectives as well. And that defines sort of the interaction. But broadly speaking, even looking at the first 2 months or so of the presidency, I think what we're seeing is, in the first Trump administration, many observers and experts and even members of the administration recommended to take President Trump very seriously, but not literally. I think we're seeing a shift from that, right? You do have to take the president literally in many things he has put out there in his campaign, on the campaign trail, but also in the first few weeks of his administration. That's one thing. Second, I think what's really important, what we've learned from a number of political leaders interacting with the president and engaging in sort of, whether it's tariff escalations or other political spats, is really not to show your hand too early, not to show weakness too early. In other words, don't be Colombia, where you fold in one day after massive escalation. Don't be Canada early on, where then Prime Minister Trudeau rushed to Mar-a-Lago before President Trump was even sworn in, and sort of got in return a lot of heckling from the president, from President-elect Trump at the time, and which continues this Canada as the 51st state, and the Governor Trudeau and these kind of things. And then I think you really need to have a clear plan and thought through what your objectives are, what your negotiating mass is, where you're willing to take things on the chin, just let things pass by, comments, especially in public, and where you need to draw red lines or lines and really escalate to de-escalate. So it's a combination of tactics, but I think you need to have a really clear picture of what you want out of a potential deal, where your vulnerabilities and your strengths are, and also how you get to a landing zone, how you design a win for this administration, for the president personally.
It's very clear. Thank you. So the president has also identified AI and crypto as major priorities for the US. With your expertise in digital policy, what trends should we watch in these two areas?
Yeah, I think more generally, I think we're seeing sort of again, different influences on tech policy here, right? On the one hand, we have many of your listeners will be very well aware of this sort of, tech right or tech optimists from Silicon Valley that have thrown their weight behind President Trump. And certainly the most visible incarnation of that is Elon Musk and his role in the administration, that sort of drive for deregulation, more pro-innovation friendly libertarian principles when it comes to developing technology policy and specifically AI and crypto, sort of getting government out of the way in many ways. And we've seen sort of the other major big tech CEOs aligning with that and trying to curry favor with the Trump administration. And we've seen some rollback of even minimal regulation or government guidelines in the form of the AI executive order under President Biden that was immediately revoked. And so you have that potential, right? And then you have also elements of the administration, the populist right and not so traditional MAGA Republicans that really have a much more critical view of not just big tech, which is sort of a strand running in there, but also of the technologies and their impact on Americans' lives and American workers and so on. And so I think, as I already hinted at, in the foreign policy and economic policy and domestic policy front, I think you also here have some contradictions of some strands that are very pro tech and pro innovation and getting government out of the way, and then others where it's sort of a tradition of reining in big tech, right? And some of the nominations on the White House Office of Science and Technology policy side or at the Department of Justice sort of more hint at that latter camp, right? And how that plays out, I think we will have to see. But I think watching how these different groups influence policy, I think that's what I'm watching on the technology policy front.
Okay, so maybe we can zoom out for a second and talk about geopolitics a little bit more, which is also a super relevant conversation that many people are concerned with right now. So your work is mainly focused on the transatlantic relations. Now we've seen in the last years that there was a quite noticeable pivot in the US attention towards the Pacific. How do you see this shaping the global balance of power in the coming years?
I would challenge that a little bit, right? We've seen this full pivot of the United States to the Indo-Pacific and to attention to Asia and China specifically, and the great power challenge of China. I think that has been the theme of a number of administrations in the past. And then the realities of geopolitics has sort of gotten in the way in many ways, right? You had already the announced pivot of the Obama administration to the Indo-Pacific, to Asia. And then the administration found itself dealing with the first invasion of Ukraine, with other major challenges in Europe. So that was part of US policy, but it wasn't the only defining shift. I think you had the same issue under the Biden administration that wanted to park Russia, wanted to sort of, also shift to the Indo-Pacific, and then had to deal with the largest land war since World War II in Europe, and with Russia's aggression and full-scale invasion, second invasion of Ukraine. And so I think it's easy to a little bit overstate that. Of course, in the new administration, as there was in the preceding administrations, you have powerful voices that say we need to focus on the one and overriding challenge of China. We don't have the resources to do much else or a lot of major geopolitical and global order things, and we really need to focus on the China challenge in a military, defense, security, technology, economic, and other ways. And you're seeing that camp in this administration in terms of different foreign policy camps, MAGA, a sort of neo-Reaganite camp, and sort of a restrainer slash Asia first camp in this administration. And again, there are contradictions, there are tensions, as is not that unusual with new administrations, right? Considering this is a second term but interrupted by another presidency. And so we will see how that exactly plays out.
One other thing we see in the US China relation is the tech race between the two nations is intensifying, particularly in the areas of AI and semiconductors. How do you see this competition evolving, and what should global business leaders take away from this?
I think on the technology competition, you have some interesting developments, right? You have, first of all, the emergence of these new AI models out of China, DeepSeek and Baidu's new model and others that sort of challenge the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of the US approach, spending billions and billions to innovation to ever more powerful AI models underpinned by ever more powerful processors, right, and semiconductors. But on the other hand, also a U.S. policy of trying to restrict technology availability through export controls and other economic security measures to China. And really, this emergence of these Chinese models is really challenging that. And then I think we have an interesting development in the overall technology competition in that China's control, at least advances, are moving downstream. I mean, at the very bottom, China already controls the rare earths supply and processing of these minerals that are essential for all sorts of technology applications, defense and security applications. And you move up, you can look at the battery supply chain, you look at now the EV sector. And so you have China really moving ahead in all of these different technology areas. Then again, the United States still maintains an important lead in other significant sectors. So it's a really mixed picture. But I think the old strategies and policies that we've seen the Trump 1 administration, the Biden administration, and now under consideration under the Trump 2 administration again, these strategies of especially this economic security and export control heavy mechanisms or tools, I should say, really coming into question in some of these key technology areas in the broader context of that competition.
And the US China relationship in general is very complex. Can you help our audience understand the key dynamics that drive this relationship today?
That's a big question. I'm not a sinologist, so
you only get the easy questions today.
I only get the easy questions. That's quite all right. I think clearly this relationship is also driven by sort of what, how the Europeans like to describe this trifecta of different dynamics between competition on the economic front, cooperation on some issues, and then strategic rivalry in the geopolitical sense. I think that also holds true. I think that the cooperation side is definitely heavily receding. The United States and China are more direct geopolitical competitors in the Pacific, given the United States' role as a security guarantor for Japan, for South Korea and other countries in the region, the more direct confrontation between the two militaries. And then certainly the framing of the relationship much more in terms of competition and rivalry. Also, when it comes to, you already brought up technology issues and economic issues. And so I think those are all important drivers. Then you have the personality of President Trump that started out as a China hawk, but I think his approach to China is also somewhat balanced by this sort of great power approach that we're now seeing much more clearly, where he wants himself and the United States to be seen amongst sort of the great powers, and he certainly counts China and President Xi among that, and be able to do some sort of deal. And you have sort of the questions around his comments on Taiwan and whether the United States would come to its defense. So you have a very complex picture that's also, again, always influenced by President Trump's own personality, his personal view of these international relationships, not just between countries, but also between leaders.
Hi there. Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying What's Next and find value in these conversations, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe or follow the podcast. It's the best way to make sure you never miss an episode, and it helps us bring more incredible insights to you. Your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being part of this journey. And when we move from the Pacific back to the Atlantic, the US-EU partnership has been critical for many decades, and now it seems that there's a growing divide between the US and the EU on many levels. Do you think that there's room for alignment, and what would this alignment look like?
Very good question. I think in the short term, we're looking at more tense and more disputed relations. We're all aware of the tariff announcements by the president on steel and aluminum, on general reciprocal, so-called reciprocal tariffs, the retaliation to the retaliation of EU retaliatory tariffs in response to President Trump's announcements. And really a feeling that, especially on the MAGA side of things, on a certain circle of key actors in the administration that view the EU critical, not just in terms of economic terms, but also for ideological reasons, right? As this, and the president has verbalized this as this tariff and taxation machine in many ways, the EU that punishes and exploits and takes advantage of American companies and America writ large. And I think that will stand in the way. It's already standing in the way. I think in many ways, the European Union's reaction to the US tariff announcements has come in at that level because there is a fear that the US and this administration is after the European Union, put it a little bit simply. And that's why the EU has to react more forcefully. That's very different from, for example, Japan and the UK that have sort of taken a more constrained approach to the initial announcements, and then we'll probably try and make some adjustments and hope that that gets them to a deal. But when you have a much more fundamental challenge to the relationship and to the core of the EU, and the fear that the Trump administration is simply aiming to divide and conquer when it comes to the European Union, then I think that you get to this conclusion of a much more forceful response that we've seen from the European Commission thus far. And so in the short term, I think the outlook for this relationship is really difficult. That's, I think, a challenge not just for Europe, but also for the United States. We are talking about a $9.3 trillion, I think is the latest figures, $9.3 trillion relationship between the two, not just trade in goods and services, but also a real profit center for American companies, Europe being worth sort of $4 trillion in foreign affiliate profits, or revenue, I should say, not profits. And on the European side, European companies making 3.5+ trillion US dollars in their operations in the United States. And so this is a major underpinning and really a strategic asset, this economic relationship alone, for the United States and for the European Union when you look at a very volatile, dangerous, and unstable geopolitical environment. And when you look at strategic competition, we've already touched on security matters, geopolitical matters, we've touched on technology and economic competition. In all of those areas, this relationship actually is a strategic asset for the United States in strategic competition with China, but also in Europe's own geopolitical positioning, not just vis-a-vis China, but other challengers as well. And so ultimately, long story short, I think the United States and Europe have nowhere else to go but to come back to this relationship. But it is a concern whether we will see how much damage we might do to this relationship in the meantime with escalating tariff wars, with war of words that just embolden other contenders, other challengers of what we would still like the world to look like. And I think in very broad terms, without the tyranny of details, we still look at the world in broadly compatible terms.
Absolutely. And you already mentioned that we seem to be in the transitional phase of world orders, right? It seems that the liberal rules-based system is in decline and the next order is still largely undefined. What is your take on what the next world order might look like and how could the US shape it?
Look, I'm not quite willing to give up quite yet on the global order. I think, of course, we all know and pretty aware of the dysfunctionalities in many areas, whether you look at national financial institutions, whether you look at the UN system, whether you look at the WTO and global trading system. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for reshaping those systems and those frameworks and institutions. I think also we should be very careful not to fall into the trap of sort of Chinese and Russian talking points about the emergence of multipolarity and, how that is of great advantage and sort of really a tool to peel us apart between the United States and Europe. More broadly speaking, I think it's very unclear. I talked about the tensions and the contradictions of what the Trump administration on the foreign policy, defense policy, but also on the international economic policy front is trying to achieve. I think the jury is definitely out whether that is possible. I think we shouldn't underestimate the costs of giving up on these alliances and these frameworks to the United States and to Europe. And our president CEO, Fred Kemp, always puts it in a very interesting way. We've seen sort of major inflection points after World War I, after World War II, after the post-Cold War, or after the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall came down, German reunification, and how the United States responded to that moment of shaping the global order. In the first case, after World War I, the United States walked away from international engagement in many ways, and in at least that created some space for actors that then we saw the rise of totalitarianism, fascism. We're both German. We know that history of that interwar period all too well, and then World War II, and that was U.S. disengagement. And then he generally talks about an aberration after the Second World War, right, where the United States brought in some of those defeated, created a different global order under U.S. leadership together with Europeans that served all of us pretty well for several decades. And where the United States, at least for Europe, I should say, was a pretty benign protector of that order and sort of benign hegemon, right, in those terms. After the post-Cold War period, I think that's sort of less clear, but what we're really hoping for is a continuation of an aberration, right? That's really Fred's quote, and I think that's a good way of looking at this. I think that will require the European Union and European countries really to step up and see and think creatively of how to fix some of those dysfunctionalities in the system. I think European voters and European publics are also, highly aware, and that's where I don't think the discontent is that far apart when it comes to some of these issues, especially on the economic and global trading front. And then think creatively about solutions here, but also throw their weight behind that and show solutions to the Trump administration. And I think, again, we're waiting for some of these contradictions to work out. And so I think Europe would be well advised not to give up completely on the United States engaging with this if it can be shown to be of value and we can make actual progress on some of these dysfunctionalities.
Yes. So from the big picture, geopolitics, back to the US maybe, what do you think are the biggest blind spots in how people think about the US?
The biggest blind spots. So, look, I think in terms of this administration specifically, the president has come and his team have come out of the gates really ready to move fast, act decisively, break things, being willing to break things even at the cost of some secondary or unintended consequences. And I think we'll have to see how exactly that plays out. I think we're already seeing, in terms of some economic and market volatility, in terms of the impact of what the Elon Musk's effort under Doge is doing on the government efficiency front and cutting back government services, government employees, government funding, and how that is impacting not just here in Washington, D.C., a very specific government-centric bubble, right, but also impacting services and economic sectors and industries and consumers across the United States. And we will have to see how exactly that plays out. And I think the jury is still out. And that's not necessarily sort of a blind spot in a strict sense. But in terms of these unintended or secondary consequences that the administration doesn't seem to fully factor into its decisions in many cases, I do think that is a blind spot. Secondly, I think really on the foreign policy and geopolitical front, we should remember that the United States, we talked about the global order as still an essential actor in that order, doesn't always choose its own priorities. I think sometimes foreign policy crisis and priorities find an administration. And I think we've seen that with a number of administrations over the recent decade or two. Even the Biden administration, I already mentioned this, was probably keen to park Russia, to really extract itself from too much European engagement and really focus on the Indo-Pacific and on China. And then within pretty much a year of coming into office, it had to focus its full foreign policy attention on the largest land war in Europe since World War II, on Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It then, a couple of years later, had to focus on a major escalation at the largest war in the Middle East that we've seen in many years. And so I think one of the blind spots is clearly what foreign policy crisis might emerge. I think a very clear one is also the ramifications, repercussions, reverberations, and unintended secondary consequences of whatever deal or settlement we might get to in terms of Russia's war in Ukraine, right? And I think what implications that has for European order, for European security and the architecture thereof, I think that's something that I would definitely count among the blind spots. Even if the Trump administration does not necessarily want to focus on this, it might end up having to focus on this depending on how exactly that settlement turns out, what President Putin does, how President Xi perceives and China perceives an eventual settlement and what it thinks that tells us about the United States, its foreign policy, President Trump's willingness to engage globally, about red lines that the administration has, and what that means for China's own assertiveness and potential aggression in the Taiwan Strait, across the wider Indo-Pacific. And so I think this interplay, this is never static. This is a constant action and reaction, and how that plays out, I think, especially with an administration that doesn't necessarily think through third, fourth, and fifth tier repercussions and reverberations of their decisions, is vulnerable to those kind of blind spots.
Yeah. So when we look into politics in the US, the last election was extremely polarized. How can this divide close in the future?
Yeah, I think that's another one of these easy questions, Philip. But clearly we're seeing heightened levels of polarization in the political discourse and politics of the United States at home. I don't think it's entirely unprecedented. I mean, there were previous periods where we had historically in the United States and in Europe as well, really high degrees of polarization in domestic politics. I do think there is a new dimension because of the media and social media dynamics and landscapes that we're seeing. And clearly, there's not one silver bullet. There's not one solution to this. I think it really is a combination of political leadership, What do our political elites choose, and what incentives do they have to engage in a different kind of political discourse and political strategies? Um, Clearly, education, especially on the social media side, plays into this. But quite apart from any government or public sector initiatives, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really remember we have agency in all of this as well. And that goes especially for those active in political and policy discussions, reminding ourselves that how we approach political discourse, how we handle and assess and process information that's out there in unprecedented volumes and sometimes speeds as well. And how we engage with those opinions and counterparts that are not aligned with our own view of the world and of politics and any specific policy issues. How we handle that as individuals, and especially individuals in this broader political and policy space that we're in. I think really accepting that agency and taking that agency seriously. And, there's a lot of discussion about leadership in all sorts of different areas. I don't think there is leadership other than leadership by example. And so you need to live those values that you want to see enacted in the broader debate. I know that's sort of a cop-out in some ways, but overall, I really do believe it's not going to be this one strategic initiative government or anyone else enacts. It's incumbent upon all of us.
I have one last difficult question for you. So this podcast is called What's Next? So if we fast forward to the next election, 2029, what do you think are going to be the most pressing issues in this election?
Clearly, it's the economy, stupid. I think we saw that over the last few U.S. elections. That's going to be the number one issue. How President Trump has handled the economy, and by extension, his successor, or certainly his heir apparent in the Republican Party, will have to stand or fall by that measure. And I think we saw that in the last election already, the cost of living, inflationary pressures, and how that dominated pretty much every other consideration, with sort of some of these security, migration, law and order issues as a sort of runner-up. But I still think the economy will be the key issue that the next election will be fought on. A lot of this will depend on, obviously, how some of those tensions that we talked about in the Trump administration's economic policies, its reshaping of U.S. international economic and financial policies will play out. There's, again, massive tensions there between tariffs as revenue raising and then at the same time a reindustrialization tool, and how exactly that gets resolved. I think that will be the focus of the next election. And then it also depends on a lot on what the opposition party does. What do the Democrats do? What lessons learned do they take away from the last election in particular, from the party's positioning and general positioning, and whether the party can again build a broad coalition that includes a massive appeal to the center and independence, that includes new economic narrative that goes beyond just deliverism, right? I think there's also this discussion that the Biden administration was very much focused on, we're delivering on this, we're delivering on that, we're delivering on strengthening, delivering a economic policy, a foreign policy for the middle class and so on, but without an overall vision and a narrative. And so can the Democratic Party figure that out over the next 3.5 years and really challenge a Trump successor on the political right?
We covered a lot in the last minutes, from geopolitics to domestic policy to foreign policy to even, changing world orders potentially. So we like to end this show on a positive note. We ask all guests this one question, which is, what makes you optimistic about the future?
tough question for a German. We're not naturally inclined to optimism here. I still think when you look at the United States, it's such a diverse country, and don't mean that just in, the background of the people, but also in terms of economic structures, in terms of its political dynamics, in terms of the richness of the people. And I think overall, the United States, the broad majority of the population is not supportive of policies that completely withdraw the United States from international engagement or from doing the right thing globally, becoming engaged in support of good causes. And I think average Americans are showing that on a daily basis. I was just speaking to a group last week that does that as part of a Rotary effort. And so I think you're seeing that across so many different groups and initiatives, and really those people wanting to tackle the challenges that the United States, but also its partners and allies and countries and individuals around the world face across the board, really the United States and its citizens wanting to engage in these issues. I think that gives me a lot of cause for optimism. And then I think also what we've seen in the last few weeks, it's imperfect, it's fits and starts, it's maybe way too late in many respects, but the way that others have started to step up, and that certainly referring to Europe, really understanding that it is a different point in time, that we're looking at a different geopolitical dynamic, that we have to confront some really uncomfortable issues and challenges and do something about these, and not just figure out the money to support that, but also the strategies and the real policy tools and the institutional capacities and capabilities to really step up for Europe and for the Transatlantic partnership in many ways. And so I think these combinations of these different things, developments that we're seeing, and the incredible depth of not just the people of the United States, but also the relationship with Europe, that gives me some reasons for optimism and for hope.
Wonderful. Jörn, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights into what's next for the United States and the world. To our listeners, stay tuned for more thought-provoking discussions on what's next, where we continue exploring the forces shaping our future. See you next time.
Thank you very much for having me, Philip. Great to talk to you.
Hey.